Welcome to the final, and in my own view, the most interesting lecture in IRL 102, an introduction to international relations. So today will be the final lecture on international relations theory. Next week we'll be looking at case studies, and I will be bringing you up to the very latest update on theorizing in international relations. I'm going to be using you as guinea pigs to try and test out some ideas which I will be testing out at the International Studies Association Annual Convention next week. So the second part of this lecture would introduce you to the work which I am working on at the moment, which is post-Western international relations. The panel I'm on at the ISA is called Post-Western International Relations. What is it and how does it work? So I will need to come up with an answer to these questions, and I hope to be able to try and think about an answer to this question towards the end of today's lecture. But the main focus will be on post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is now an established theory of international relations. International relations theorists can no longer ignore post-colonial theorists, even though they've been trying to do so ever since the inception of post-colonial theory over 30 years ago. So post-colonialism may be seen to share much of the common intellectual territory as post-structuralism. They're both posts. So what do we understand by the post? Remember, the post always rings twice. This means there are always two meanings to post. Sachka, you must put up your hand first. Okay. Don't you want to look at the form?
So post means after, so one means like it's the end, like you said, it terminates one era.
Good. And what's the second?
The second is like chronologically speaking, like after. Maybe not.
No, I think you've understood it very well, but that's the first meaning. The post would mean it's over, in this sense. But what's another meaning of the post, which I think is also very interesting? So the first meaning of the post, as Sachka pointed out, meant it's basically temporal. Temporal in this sense means it's a period of time which is over, which has finished, which is finished. So in this sense, it can be a rejection of this idea. But what's the other understanding of the post? We looked at it in conjunction with postmodernism and post-structuralism on Monday.
Post means also after, in chronological order.
That's what she just said.
Oh, is it over?
Yeah, so over in a chronological sense, but also there's another understanding of the post. What does it mean? Chronologically, if it's over, it means it's finished, it's stopped, but what else can happen?
So someone says overcoming contradictions.
That's a very Hegelian way of looking at it. So very good. But post-colonialists and post-structuralists would say, we can't overcome contradictions. So we don't have to be so theoretical in terms of overcoming contradictions. This would be very much part of the Marxist approach. So critical theorists would say overcoming contradictions. So in this sense, you're quite right. If we look at political theory, there is post-Marxist political theory. This refers to the work of the Frankfurt School, Antonio Gramsci. So they're working within a Marxist framework and trying to overcome the contradictions within it. And in actual fact, a lot of the first generation of post-colonial scholars, usually from South Asia, there were historians, were Marxist. So they came out of the Marxist tradition. So in this sense, you're quite right. But that's not the meaning of the post when we look at post-colonialism or post-structuralism. Let's work on this. Overcoming contradictions means what? What's implied if we talk in terms of overcoming contradictions? Imply here means what are the assumptions upon which it's based, overcoming contradictions?
Something new theory emerged.
Good, but what does it emerge out of?
The past theory.
And yes, so in this sense, it's a new theory. The old theory has given birth to the new theory, if we look at it in simpler language, rather than using overcoming contradictions. So what is the relationship between the new theory and the old theory?
It's interrelated.
Very good. Interrelated, or another simpler word of saying, you can just get rid of the inter.
Related.
Related, I think, is better. It's a continuation here. So when we talk of postmodernism, we're also talking, firstly, a rejection or refutation of the main arguments of modernism, but also arguing that modernism is alive and well. It's a continuation as well. So it's a rejection and continuation at the same time. So when we look at post-colonialism, what here is the key concept? When we looked at post-structuralism, let's start with postmodernism. When we look at postmodernism, the main argument was that postmodernism was a rejection of the main ideas of modernism. And what's modernity based on? What's the central principle upon which modernity is based, at least according to Weber, Max Weber? Very good. Rationality, rationalization. So what post-structuralism tries to do is critique the idea of reason. And in this sense, post-colonialism shares the same critique of postmodernism. Post-structuralism rejects the idea of structure, but at the same time believes that structures are alive and well and influence our identities in the social world through discourse. So when we look at post-colonialism, what do post-colonial theorists reject, but at the same time believe is continuing today? Excellent. Thank you, Yuka. So colonialism, basically, that should be the end of the lecture. You've understood the main point of the lecture. So post-colonialism is both a rejection, a normative rejection of colonialism, yet post-colonial theorists believe that colonialism is with us today. Now, this is slightly different from decolonial theory. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to decolonial theory, but what do you understand by the concept of decolonization?
Once a country which was a colony of another state became independent, and it can be independent from the state that controlled it before.
So in this sense, decolonization is independence. Now, post-colonialism is based on the assumption that although colonialism was formally terminated during the period after the Second World War, particularly after the General Assembly Resolution 1514 in 1960, which shifted the grounds upon which statehood was granted. So beforehand, the main criteria were empirical. Empirical meant you had to prove that you were capable of self-government. After United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1514, the main grounds became normative, juridical in this sense. You had a shift from de facto statehood, trying to prove that you had a state, to de jure statehood. De jure statehood means you had the right to a state by right. Now, post-colonial theorists argue, historically, who gets to be independent? So if we look at the wave of independence beginning in 1947 with the independence of India and Pakistan, continuing arguably up to 1990 with the formal end of the apartheid system in South Africa. The formal end of colonialism may be seen as 1980 with independence of Zimbabwe. What do we see? Who becomes independent?
Former colonies.
Very good. Former colonies become independent. Now, this allows us, or this necessitates, a further exploration into the process of colonization. So when we talk about former colonies becoming independent, how is this different from the main idea of nationalism and national self-determination upon which the international order was founded? So remember, if you cast your minds back before Christmas and before Shogatsu to the conference Beyond Nationalism, what's the main argument made for the granting of sovereign statehood in international society? What do you need to prove you are in order to be a state?
Sovereign.
You need to prove that you're sovereign, but my argument is, what do you need to be in order to be sovereign? So you can't say I'm sovereign in order to be sovereign. Yep.
Have control over a certain territory.
Very good. That's empirical statehood. But what do all states claim to be?
I mean,
Very good. They claim to be nations. Now, if we look at the formation of the international order after the Peace of Versailles in 1919, we find that the principle of national self-determination becomes constitutive of the international order. This is based on the idea that all states have a right to independence. Now, what was the contradiction here in 1919 in the Peace of Versailles? So if we look at Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, he makes it explicit that all nations should have the right to determine their own destiny and therefore have a state of their own. Which nations, in inverted commas, enjoyed this right after the First World War?
Poland.
Oh?
Poland.
Not just Poland. I mean, there were other states with it. Yep. No?
The empires?
My question was, which states enjoyed the principle of national self-determination? How can you say empires did? That's a contradiction.
The ones that control the colonies.
I'm not sure I understand. I think it's easier to say, who was it denied to? I think that's the answer of the question. You're trying to answer the question, who didn't have it? So who didn't have the right of national self-determination now?
The colonized.
Yes, the colonized. Good. So in this sense, national self-determination existed for the colonizers, but not the colonized. It existed for the former areas or territories of the Austro-Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also of the Russian Empire and the German empires, the emerging German empires. But it was denied to the British Empire, to colonies to British colonies. It was denied to French colonies. And remember that in 1914, Britain and France not only were the main colonial powers, but they controlled much of the Earth's surface, maybe 50% of the Earth's surface. The sun never set literally on the British Empire, because when it was dawn in one part of the British Empire, it was dusk in another part of the British Empire. Now, after the Second World War, we have movements towards decolonization. India and Pakistan become independent in 1947. Sri Lanka in 1948. The first colony in Africa, in continental Africa, Ghana, the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast becomes independent and calls itself Ghana in 1957. So we find that all of these territories from 1947 right up to 1980 become formally independent. Now, the premise of post-colonialism is that even though they become formally independent and they can sit in the United Nations, they are still colonized. So in this sense, decolonization signals an end to colonialism formally, but colonialism still continues. Now, this is slightly different from the decolonial framework, which I'll be looking at perhaps later. The decolonial framework would say we still need to decolonize. It is possible to decolonize. We need to decolonize. Post-colonialism stops at the assertion that colonialism still exists today, that colonialism still persists today. Now, we will need to unpack these terms. So firstly, what do you understand by colonialism? Seiji has given us a definition of decolonization. What do you understand by colonialism? What is it in Japanese? Colonialism. Yeah, shokumin shugi. Sorry, Yuka, what you say?
No, shokumin hasn't.
Yeah, so what do you understand by colonization or colonialism?
Controlling another country, state.
Oh, no, this is really important. Thank you for bringing this up. This goes right to the heart of post-colonial theory. It is controlling. We can't use country, but we cannot use state. What can we use? What are states based on? Huh? Yeah, excellent. Controlling another territory. Now, this is the really important question. Why can't we use state? In international relations, states are always the answer. As realists say, a state is a state is a state. Why can't we use states? Realists would say, of course we can use states.
The states no longer have sovereign, so it can be called states.
I think we need to make a distinction here between a state and a sovereign state. So sovereignty, what are the two principles of sovereignty? There's an internal dimension and an external dimension. What's the internal dimension of sovereignty? Law is important, good.
Controlling a defined territory.
Yeah, you need to first control a defined territory. Law governs the population in that territory. What's the external definition of sovereignty, the external dimension to sovereignty?
Should be recognized as a sovereign state by the other sovereign state.
Very good. Recognition. States are constituted by recognition. They need to be recognized. This is the problem for ISIS. They're not recognized. So even though they have de facto a monopoly of a use of force in many parts of Syria and Iraq, they are not recognized as a state. And we see this in Western media reports which talk in terms of the so-called Islamic State. Good. Now, what is the problem with saying that colonialism is basically the control of one state by another state? This is a really difficult question, but if you understand this, then you will understand the post-colonial argument or post-colonial perspective.
This implies that the colonies or organized states. So there is so those colonies can be considered as states, which it is unlikely.
Okay, very good. Yeah, they were not states beforehand, and this is really important. Those of you who attended the first session of the SSRI Sophia Symposium on Beyond Nationalism, which looked at the work of Rabindranath Tagore, who offered a critique of nationalism 100 years ago, but supported the principles of decolonization. Now, his main argument was essentially an argument which many post-colonial theorists have accepted, which is the concept of the nation, the concept of the state is a European concept. If we look at many parts of Asia, even if we look at Japan, which probably is the one non-Western society which approximates, which closely reflects the socio-economic and political structure of the modern West, we find that you don't have the same centralization of power in the hands of the state. The state itself was absent. It was an imposition. It was primarily an administrative unit. If we look at Japan before the Meiji Restoration, there was no state. It's only after the Meiji Ishin that we self-consciously have a state. Japan was not colonized in a formal sense. However, many post-colonial theorists would say that Japan continues to be colonized, even though they were never formally colonized, or Japan was never formally colonized. So we can see there's a distinction here between the act of colonization and colonial ideas. Colonial ideas, such as the state, continue after colonialism. So for post-colonial and decolonial theorists, the fact that there was decolonization does not mean that colonialism disappeared. So let's get back to my original question, which I think Seiji partially answered. Who gets to be independent? Decolonization means independence for who? Seiji mentioned former colonies. But how do you know you're a former colony? What do you need in order to get independence? What do you need in order to be sovereign? My question is before recognition. What can you get before recognition? What do you need to demonstrate before recognition? So you have a right. You have a right to independence. But who can claim that independence? Yep.
The centralized government?
Very good. The centralized government means what if we look at empires? So what was the centralized government? Good. The administrative unit. What was the administrative unit?
In a centralized government, every decision making are made in the capital, and there is no regional or local government.
That was only in the French Empire, the idea of département. So if we look at the French Empire, the French ruled their colonies as extension of France. A bit like the way, to use a controversial argument, Okinawa is regarded as, it's not even a prefecture, it's seen as part of Japan in this sense. So the French believed Algeria, Senegal, French West Africa were départements of France. Now, Seiji is correct. The most important decisions were made in the metropoles. Metropoles will be in the colonial capitals, mainly in London and in Paris. But you did have administrative units. You did have Algeria, which we'll look at later. You did have Indochina in the French Empire. You did have India in the British Empire. You did have the Gold Coast in the British Empire, Rhodesia, Kenya, Uganda. What were these names of? They weren't names of nations. What were these names of?
Administrative units.
Yeah, good. So, and what do we call the administrative units here?
Province.
No, there won't be provinces.
Colonies.
I'm asking, yeah, correct. So if you were to say independent for colonies, you're correct. But if we look at the idea of colonization, colonization means colonization of territory. So you needed an administrative unit in order to claim independence. What do we call the dominant administrative unit in international relations? The basic unit of international political life. We don't call it the United Territories. We don't talk about...
Nation?
Actually, not here, nation, because the key question here is what I'm trying to show the difference of is the idea of national self-determination and decolonization. So if we look at national self-determination, let's look at the example. The most famous examples are Italy and Germany. I think if we look at the First World War period, then we can include Poland. I think Poland's a very good example. But here the argument is an Italian nation, a German nation, a Polish nation existed. An Italian nation arguably existed. Its roots went back to the Roman Empire. So in this sense, it was old. But the state, modern Italy, was new. The same argument can be made for Japan after the Meiji issue. Now, why can't that argument be made for Gold Coast, for Côte d'Ivoire, for India even? What's it got to do with democracy?
Because they cannot be considered as nations.
Why can't they be considered as nations? Good.
Constituted of many ethnic with different languages.
Excellent. There are different views of nationalism. I have another class, 200 level class, IRL 215, which I'll be offering in the autumn term, which just looks at nationalism. So we'll be looking at many different theories of nationalism. But I think Seiji is correct to say this. Basically, the answer is that they were administrative units which comprised of many different peoples with many different cultures, many different languages. If we look at the modern state of India today, it has 47 different languages, 47 different official languages. So we find very many cultures and ethnicities were comprised in these administrative units. These administrative units were called states. They were colonial states. They weren't sovereign states, but they were states. So the promise of decolonization was, we can give you independence. We will recognize you as a sovereign state. But who are you? How do we recognize you? We can only recognize you if you are a former colony and if you have a state which can be recognized. And this, I think, is very important when we look at post-colonial theory. Or actually, post-colonialism. Post-colonial, we cannot talk in terms of post-colonial theory because it rejects the conception of theory. It shares a lot in common with post-structuralism. But the argument here is that decolonization has not really taken place at the level of ideas. The formerly colonized people are still mentally colonized. They still accept and have internalized Western categories, such as nation, such as state, such as the ideas of rights to property. This post-colonial argument, as I said, can even be extended to Japan, which has never been formally colonized, which was a colonizer. But you could argue, as some very few post-colonial theorists have argued, that after the Second World War, we find that not only was Japan occupied by US forces, but Western ideas also became prevalent in Japan and were internalized by the Japanese as Japanese ideas or as universal ideas. We'll look at this in greater depth later in the lecture. But I just wanted to pause and to ask you whether you've understood the main point which we have looked at in the lecture so far. So the main point has been for post-colonial theory that decolonization has not brought an end to colonization. Formal independence does not mean an end of the dominance of Western ideas in international relations. Any questions on that? Okay, good. Now we can start the slideshow. So post-colonialism seeks to resist colonialism in its material and ideational form, whether cultural, political, economic, or social. So one understanding of colonialism is the understanding which Seiji introduced us to, which is the control of a particular territory and the people who live on that territory by an external power. This is formal political colonialism. However, post-colonial theorists believe that colonialism persists in its ideational form, in the form of ideas. So we can talk in terms of cultural imperialism, economic colonialism, or even in a place such as Japan, social colonialism. In celebrating reason, remember, if we look at the idea of modernization, modernization is based on the assumption, based on the premise of rationalization, of rationality. If we think back to the lectures on liberalism, we find that at the heart of liberalism is the idea of the individual, the rational, self-interested, autonomous individual. So in celebrating reason as the very foundation of modernity, Europeans have degraded the culture of non-European societies. So here there's a binary opposition going on. Remember, binary oppositions was a word coined, or a term coined, by Jacques Derrida. We looked at Derrida's work on Monday. So he talked in terms of binary oppositions as dichotomous categories. So we looked at the idea of light and dark. So what does it mean to talk in terms of the Enlightenment? Well, if we play with this idea, the Enlightenment means there is light. La lumière in French. What's opposed to the idea of enlightenment? If we look at it temporally. So the Enlightenment is a historical period in Western Europe. What's a historical period which can be contrasted with the Enlightenment? We looked at it on Monday. Very good, Yuka. The Dark Ages. Now, Derrida's argument is, if you talk in terms of the Enlightenment and the Dark Ages, these are two historical periods, but there is an implicit hierarchy here. Enlightenment, light, is seen as something which is more positively valued than darkness. So in this sense, when we talk of the Enlightenment, we are valorizing the Enlightenment. We're saying that things got better after the Enlightenment. There's a hierarchy involved. There's a normative value judgment. Now, what happens if we use this term spatially? What does it mean to talk in terms of the Enlightenment in Europe and the Dark Continent? Vijay Prasad, who is a post-colonial theorist, came up with a book recently which has been very influential called The Darker Nations. When he talks in terms of the Third World, the darker nations. What here does dark mean? It's not just literal. It doesn't just refer to skin color. What does darkness here mean? What does it mean to talk in terms of Africa being the dark continent, for example, or the darker nations? The Third World is the darker nations. Yep?
They are being outside history.
Excellent. Yeah, they're outside of history. They're waiting to be enlightened. They're in the dark. They need us to enlighten them. And the gift which Europe brings is reason. Reason is at the foundation of modernity. It's at the core of modernity. So you're outside of history. There's another great book before post-colonial theory was born in 1982 by somebody called Eric Wolf. And Wolf talked in terms of Europe and the people without history. The people without history is an exact quotation from Hegel's work. Hegel talked in terms of history being the history of human ideas, and specifically the history of freedom, of the world spirit, which was freedom. However, there were many parts of the world which were seen as without history. So if we look at India, Hegel wrote about India and said India was in a state of a dreamland. It was like a dream. It did not exist within the modern. There was no conception here of freedom. China as well was outside of history. So in celebrating reason, the Europeans have degraded, in this sense, the culture of non-European societies. So implicitly, by saying Europe is rational, Europe is modern, and counterposing it to other societies outside of Europe, societies which they have colonized, they are saying implicitly that we are rational. They are not. That's why they need us. Rationality, in this sense, becomes the ethnic property of Europeans. The term ethnic property comes from the work of Paul Gilroy, who's also a post-colonial theorist. Now, post-colonialism, and this is where I think those of you who are pretty astute will see that there's a common theme running through the constitutive theories of international relations: critical theory, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism. So the argument here is that not just that Europeans have degraded the culture of non-European societies in the past during the period of colonization, but that this persists in the present. This continues in the present. And this continues in the present because in academic disciplines such as international relations and political science and history, we reproduce the originary act of colonization. So post-colonialism implicates academic disciplines, international relations, political science, in particular anthropology. if we look, let's look at anthropology. What's the difference between anthropology and sociology? There is a department of anthropology and sociology. Here at ICU, it's all very small. But what's really the difference? What does anthropology look at? Huh? Yeah. It does look at humans, good. I'd like to think that even international relations sort of looks at humans, but realists would say no. Hey, Moe, you're here.
I'm here, but I'm back.
Okay. You've decolonized. Okay.
Multiple and ideal morality, and also like the variation in culture. Yes.
Yeah, I would say just culture. Yeah, basically looks at cultures. Good. What does sociology look at?
Behavior.
Yeah, that's structuralism. If we look at sociology, structuralism is very important within sociology. So behavior of what?
Of human beings.
Yeah, so that's the idea of humans. What generally, why is it called sociology and not behaviorology? Behavioralism is again one important argument within sociology. Moe.
See the impact of someone doing something to someone else. Who is doing that to her?
Why is it called sociology?
Because it's like socializing.
Society, yeah. So anthropology looks at culture, sociology looks at society. What's the difference? No?
Looking at different groups of people.
Very good now. So what groups of people do anthropologists like hanging out with?
So I guess more primitive.
Oh, very good. What do primitive? We don't use that in anthropology anymore.
So I guess from a European sense, they're less knowledgeable and they're not non-European.
Yeah, I think this is really important. If we look at anthropology, in Japan, I think it's different. But when we look at the West, most anthropology departments are now merged with sociology departments. This happened in my former university in London. It happens here at ICU with MCC, with anthropology and sociology. Now, generally, sociologists tend to look at society in general. Society here may be seen as developed societies. Developed societies are included within sociology. In the past, although not now, anthropologists looked at culture in non-European societies. So anthropologists were always the coolest people to hang around in graduate school. They always went to really exotic places and came back with stories which they wrote in their doctoral dissertations and their books. Of course, that's not what anthropologists do now because of post-colonialism. Because of post-colonialism, anthropologists need to write specifically about themselves and their relationship with the peoples who they encounter. But this division here between anthropology and sociology replicates the division or reproduces the division between developed and developing, between colonized and colonizer. What's a more easier target than even anthropology? What academic discipline or sort of discipline, in ICU it's an IDM, an interdisciplinary major, reproduces colonial divisions. So the division between the colonized and the colonized. Some of you have taken this course. Yep.
Would linguistics be one of the examples?
I wouldn't know. I don't know very much about linguistics. How would you, what's your argument with linguistics? Please go ahead.
The major trend that had an sort of like a comparison between the European, Indo-European languages and the non-European languages, that might be your sign of colonial division.
I think that's very good. Yeah, good. The only issue with Indo-European languages is it's also Indians who also speak them. So in that sense, it doesn't reproduce a dominant colonial division, but I think you're correct. It does differentiate between those people who are in possession of a language which is derived from Indo-European or Aryan languages, or on the other hand from Chinese languages, and those whose languages are not. So in this sense, I think it probably replicates or reproduces the division between modern societies and indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples will be peoples whose languages are unintelligible to people in so-called modern societies. But I think that's a good example. What would be an easier example? Very good. Development studies. What's that? Not here at ICU because it's post-development studies. But what is development studies? What's development about? What does development mean? Huh? Hanako? No, I mean development is generic here. Development doesn't just mean economic development. What does development mean? It actually is... Sorry? No, that can be a form of development. But what does development mean in everyday language, not just development studies? Improvement. Very good. Improvement. Progress. Now, if we look at development studies, what's our focus? Are we looking at Japan? Are we looking at the United States?
Developing countries.
And where are developing countries?
In Southeast Asia or Africa.
Well, South Asia, yeah. Yeah, and what historical experience do they have in common?
They were colonized.
Yeah, they're all colonized. So when we talk of development studies, we're talking about improving societies which were colonized. Well, isn't this familiar? So what resonances does it have with colonialism? Resonances here is what sort of relationship does it have with colonialism? What echoes does it have of colonialism? What did the colonialists think they were doing when Britain went to India or France went to Algeria or even Japan going to Korea and Taiwan? What argument did they make? Or to be even more controversial, during the occupation when the US came to Japan, what arguments were they making? Very good, la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. That's what colonialism was about. We are possessed of reason. We are rational. We've had the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. We're industrialized. And it is our mission to civilize you. So this is the idea of the civilizing mission. How is that different from development studies? If we look at development studies, development practitioners talk in terms of improving the conditions of people who live in developing societies. Developing societies were societies which were formerly colonized. So in another way, it can be seen as a form of civilizing mission, as a new form of the civilizing mission. And this is quite important on the post-colonial critique. So post-colonial theorists are, as we'll see later, very skeptical about the intention of do-gooders, such as many students at ICU who want to work in JICA, or those Rotary Peace Fellows who want to go and make the world a better place. Post-colonial theorists would say, well, what makes you think that you are the solution? What makes you think that instead you are, you may actually be the problem? People may actually want to be left alone. They may not want to improve. Who says that they need to improve? Okay, we'll expand upon these ideas later. But at the core of post-colonialism is arguably an idea which they have borrowed wholesale from post-structuralism, and particularly the work of Michel Foucault. So like post-structuralists, post-colonialists note that knowledge and power are linked. There's no such thing as knowledge without power. We see this quite simply when we look at development studies. Who decides who is developed and who is not developed? Who has the power to do so?
The developed.
Yeah, very good. The developed societies have the power to decide who's developed and who's not developed. Who's developed and who's developing. Developed means we're fine. Developing means you have to become like us. And just to re-emphasize, what historical experiences do all developed or most developed societies have? What were the developed societies? Yeah, they were colonizers. So in this sense, knowledge is a function of power. So post-colonialism is skeptical of everyday knowledge, expert knowledge, as well as Western, and I think we need to include Japanese efforts to save underprivileged peoples as hiding colonial categories and tendencies. Actually I shouldn't because this is being filmed. So I was going to give you a good case study of our own programs here at ICU. So if we look at many of the JDS programs, Japan Development programs, which are made possible by JICA and JICE, we find that most of the students who come on these programs are from developing societies. They're here studying at ICU because the idea is they need training. They need training from us, so when they go back to their societies, they can contribute to the development of their societies. They can contribute to improving their societies. Now, post-colonialists would say this basically is premised on certain sets of assumptions. The assumption is that we here at ICU are fountains of knowledge. We here can help them. That's why they should be coming here. We don't have similar schemes in their societies. Even if we look at other programs which exist within ICU, and ICU I think is probably the most culturally sensitive university arguably in Japan, we find that the same programs do not exist in other societies. If you look at most of the study abroad schemes, where do you go to study abroad? Places like Cambridge or SOAS or University of California. Where are most of these academic institutions located?
The West.
Yeah, in the West. So you go to study from the West, but you don't really study in other societies. How many university partnerships do we have with South Asian or with African universities? Only, I think, Orange Free State is the only one I know of. So the idea here is you get knowledge from the West, and then you come back to Japan and you contribute to the further development of Japan. But you have very little to learn from people in the developing world. So in this sense, we find colonial categories have been internalized. What's interesting in the case of Japan is that it's really the Western historical experience which has been internalized. But we'll look at this, or we can look at this, if you like, in greater detail later. Any questions on this, on what we've looked at so far? Okay, I don't think I'll have a great deal of time to talk about post-colonial theorists. I could start by looking at Rabindranath Tagore, but we've already looked at him in the SSRI Sophia Symposium. We also discussed the work of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Gandhi is quite important because Gandhi has influenced post-colonial theory because he believed that colonization, that colonization did not end with decolonization. His argument was that in the case of India, independence, complete independence, Swaraj, self-rule from the United Kingdom would mean that Indians went back to the village, that they rejected modernity. They rejected the idea of living in an industrialized nation state. And in this sense, Gandhi influenced post-colonial theory. But I think we should perhaps start by looking at the work of Frantz Fanon, and particularly the life of Frantz Fanon. Now, I think what's important to note, and this is something which many post-colonial theorists have forgotten, is Frantz Fanon was a Marxist. So he believed in the principle of proletarian revolution. However, if you look at Frantz Fanon, you find that he is of African descent, but he was born in the French West Indies, in Martinique. Now, interestingly, along with another post-colonial theorist, Ashishandi, Frantz Fanon was actually a psychiatrist, a psychologist. Now, he was born in the French colony of Martinique. He came to Paris, he came to France, and to cut a long story short, he was racialized. Racialized in this sense meant that his racial identity as somebody of African descent was not a big deal in Martinique because most people were of African descent. But when he came to France after the Second World War, he was treated differently because he was French. Many of you may have had the same experience coming to Japan as well. If you live in a society where everybody is like you, you think that this is not a big factor or facet of your identity. But when you go to a different society, this becomes emphasized. Those of you who have lived abroad may have had the same experience. So in Japan, where everybody's Japanese, being Japanese is not a big deal. It's not an over-determining part of your identity. But if you go to a different society, particularly a European society, a Western society, which isn't multicultural, a place like Germany, etc., then you'll find a sense of Asian identity being emphasized. Now, this was important because Frantz Fanon was sent as a qualified psychiatrist by the French state to Algeria during the period of the Algerian Civil War. And he fought for the Algerians. So he left France and he fought for the Algerians. Now, the significance of Fanon is that he was a psychiatrist, meaning he was dealing with ideas. And he became politicized when he realized that the people who came to see him, the people who were seen to have psychological or psychiatric problems, were all Arab, were all Algerian. And in this sense, he felt an affinity with the Algerians, even though he wasn't from North Africa. His ancestors may have been from West Africa. He felt some sort of affinity with them. And he came to the conclusion that their psychological problems stemmed from the fact that they were being colonized. They were being denied freedom. So in this sense, Fanon, through his very life, as well as his book, La Damnée de Terre, The Wretched of the Earth, really brings in the idea of colonialism and decolonization and makes it central to modern ways of thought, modern ways of left-wing thought. Just to contextualize this, during the 1950s, during the time of the Algerian Civil War, the French Communist Party, which was one of the largest communist parties in Europe, very popular, they were in favor of colonization. Frantz Fanon himself thought of himself as a Marxist, but he could not support the French Communist Party line. The French Communist Party line seemed to make decolonization premised on the greater proletarian revolution. In other words, they prioritized the interests of the French working classes over the interests of Arab people in Algeria fighting for their independence. Now, Fanon is important in that he pays attention to language. Mastery of language affords remarkable power. Now, I'm going to expand upon this, but if we look at the lecture on post-structuralism, who says something very similar to this? The relationship between knowledge and power. Who have we looked at? Who drew our attention to the relationship between knowledge and power? So mastery of language. Language here. Language constitutes knowledge. It's a way of articulating knowledge. What did I introduce you to on Monday? An idea which combines knowledge and power. Huh? Foucault, yeah. And what was his key idea? What did he talk in terms of? What constitutes knowledge? What gives rise to knowledge? So you're absolutely correct. It is Foucault, and he believed that power and knowledge were interconnected. What's the device? Power to do what? Power to transmit knowledge through language. What do we call this? Huh? At least in French. What constitutes knowledge? What constitutes subjects? Very important if we look at the next theorist we're looking at. Discourse, yeah, discourse. It's discourse which constitutes identities. Discourse is a statement. It's an argument, something like wrong. So in this sense, when Fanon is saying mastery of language affords remarkable power, he's actually foreshadowing Foucault. He said this in 1952. Foucault was writing in the 1960s and 70s. Many of these people, people like Foucault, would have had contact with Frantz Fanon. So Fanon, in this sense, argues that it's colonial categories are transmitted through language. So he grew up, for example, in Martinique, reading French. Most of the books were written by French people. So they internalized French categories. In his book, Black Skins, White Masks, he looks at how the people living in Martinique considered themselves culturally French. And as a psychiatrist, he found it really interesting the way in which, and I think he himself also had this, many people from Martinique wanted French partners. They wanted white French partners. It was really important for them. So they wanted, in this sense, to attain whiteness, to whiten themselves. And he believed that this was part of a process, a psychological process linked with colonialism. Colonialism brings categories which are transmitted through language. We learn the language of the colonizer. And when we read the literature of the colonizer, when we read newspapers, when we read novels, we begin to identify with the colonizer. So a lot of post-colonial theory, if we can talk in terms of post-colonial theory, looks at language, looks at literature. I was going to play you the trailer to the Battle of Algiers because this is a film based on the true battle. In 1957, the Algerian, the FLN, was fighting against the French colonial government. It was a particularly bloody and brutal war, a war which ended with France's formal declaration of independence for Algeria. But considering there were a million French people living in Algeria, some of them Nobel laureates such as Albert Camus, and even philosophers such as Jacques Derrida, Algeria was seen very much as part of France. In a way, it was similar to Ireland in terms of the British colonial imaginary. So difference, slightly similar to India, so in that it was the most important French colony, but also had similarities with Ireland. So I just wanted really to show you. Okay, now looking at the trailer to this film, which is set in events which happened in 1957, what parallels can you see with the world today? What does this remind you of? If we look at these images which we have seen. So Algeria is what type of society? Yes, it's close to France, but as you can see from the images, what's the dominant religious tradition here?
Sunni Islam.
Yeah, it would be Islam. So we saw that it was screened by the Pentagon in 2003. What happened in 2003? Pentagon is the United States, with the headquarters of the U.S. defenses. Huh? Invasion of Iraq. So what significance, what implications can you see from the film to today's world, the world in which we live in? Is it very different?
It's like Iraq.
Yeah, it's like Iraq or Syria today. Again, we have the same categories. The same depiction of people still exist today. So in this sense, even though Algeria became independent in 1962, the actual events upon which the film was based, the Battle of Algiers in 1957, the FLN, which were the liberation force of Algeria fighting for independence, were militarily defeated, but at such a heavy cost that it completely undermined French legitimacy as the colonial power. The French could no longer claim that we're here to civilize you because of the lengths to which the French went in terms of trying to subdue the Algerian War of Independence. And then interestingly, in 1992, 1989 to 1992, we find another Algerian war. This time it is waged by a particular force which was opposed to the Algerian regime. This force was an Islamist force. It won the election in 1989, but the French supported the FLN, who tried to subdue the Islamist political party, the FIS. And this was actually a war which led to 100,000 people dying. Many of the people you see in Afghanistan who joined Al-Qaeda, and even today in ISIS, are veterans of this civil war. So in this sense, the idea here is that colonial categories and stereotypes still exist today. Algeria became independent. It became a socialist state. But at the same time, the apparatus of the Algerian state was the same as the French colonial state of Algiers. The French colonial state was designed to suppress the Algerian people. Therefore, the Algerian state recognized as a sovereign state, also functioned after 1989 to suppress the Algerian people, their own populations. Now, I think this allows us to move nicely on to perhaps the most influential post-colonial theorist, Edward Said. Now, Edward Said was completely and utterly uninterested in international relations and political science. He was a literature major, and he was professor of modern languages and literature at Columbia University in New York. However, in 1978, he wrote a very influential and powerful book, Orientalism. Now, Said was, unlike Fanon, a professional academic. But importantly, his own origins determined his own relationship with the work which he studied. Now, Said was, and not many people know this, he was Christian. He was a Protestant. But where was he from? He looks European. Huh?
Arab world.
He was from the Arab world, but where in particular? Yeah, he was Palestinian. He was Palestinian, and he was forced to flee the Israeli invasion and occupation after 1947. So he was stateless. He grew up stateless. Even though he went to Harvard, he joined Ivy League universities and worked at Columbia University, he still felt that he was a different subject, that he was different from the other people whose work he looked at. And in Orientalism in 1978, he wrote a book, a very powerful indictment of the prevalence of colonial stereotypes of the East, of the Orient. Now, the Orient here refers specifically to the Middle East, but can be extended to China and to Japan. Now, Said applied Foucault's understanding of power knowledge to representation of the Orient in Western discourse, of the Orient within books. Orientalism was a Western discourse to represent the societies it colonizes. Now, Said was very much influenced by Foucault, but also by Gramsci. So his argument here was, if we look at the West has managed to win the battle of ideas. Its ideas are hegemonic. They need to be challenged. But it's difficult to challenge these ideas because the West constitutes the rest of the world. I went to a university called the School of Oriental and African Studies. What is the Orient? The Orient was everywhere, from the Near East to Japan, from Turkey to Japan. What does Turkey and Japan, in this sense, have in common? But they're all constituted in the idea of the Orient. The Orient meant they were not part of the West. They were othered. They were outside. They were not part of the West. Therefore, we can study them. Why do we need to study them? I'll give you a clue here. The university where I studied was founded in 1923. What was happening in 1923 in the United Kingdom?
It was the beginning of British expansion to the east, for example, with the conflict with China.
Not 1923. That would be 1823.
Sorry, but the commerce of which China started.
I think you're correct, but it's not just about China. What did Britain do in 1923? Why did they need a school of Oriental and African studies? Why put Africa in with it?
In order to understand better those other societies, in order to more easily conquer them.
Well, more importantly, they had been conquered. They were the colonized societies. So the idea here is you need a special university where people can come to study the languages, the cultures, and more importantly, the political and social organization of the societies which you already colonize. So the graduates of the university then could go and work in the Foreign and Colonial Office. It becomes a problem for SOAS after decolonization. Graduates don't have jobs to go to in this sense. So for Said, Orientalism was a Western discourse to represent the societies it colonizes in order to further, to strengthen the grip which they have over the territories. Now let's look at post-colonialism and international relations. There's a lot more I could explain about the significance of Said. I think Said is particularly significant also in terms of how he links colonialism and Orientalism with gender. Remember that Said is basically a literature major. So his methodology is basically reading books, reading novels by the established Western canon, novels by the Shakespeares of this world, Flaubert, etc., Balzac, Auerbach. Now, how was the Orient portrayed? How was it represented? Let's look at contemporary Hollywood representations of the Orient. In order to make this more understandable for you, let's look at a place such as Japan. How is Japan represented in Hollywood films?
An exotic place.
It's seen as exotic. What goes on in this exotic place? Let's think of what films have you seen which have been set in Japan, Hollywood films? I can only think of 2 or 3. Modern films or sort of modern films, films made in your lifetime, which have been set and filmed in Japan. Actually, most of the filming hasn't been in Japan. Look, I know you don't read the news, but I think you do watch films. Yep, Moy?
I can only think of Fast and Furious.
Oh yeah.
What's that?
It was really until-
Oh, that car film, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't think anyone actually watched that. Anyone else?
And there was one, wasn't there like a Wolverine movie that was based here?
It's a wrong question. All right. Okay, I guess you guys are very young, so. Films which, were popular when you were in Shogaku, maybe. Yep.
The Last Samurai.
I think Last Samurai is good. Yeah, that would be one film. What was that about? It's about samurais. So the idea is that, Japan is populated by samurais and Tom Cruise, who's in every single shot of that film has Tom Cruise in it. I don't know how he manages it. It's actually a really interesting film. I wanted to show it when we look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism. But I just find Tom Cruise unbelievably annoying. And I could not find a single shot of the film without him in it. Name me another one. So Samurai is good. Last Samurai is good. What else? What other big film was made about Japan? So those of you who've been outside of Japan, particularly in the West or sort of underdeveloped places such as, the Midwestern region of the United States, when you say you're from Japan, people obviously think of samurais. What else do they think of? Manga now, but Huh?
Sushi.
Yeah, right. I mean, sushi's food, though. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So what here's the geisha? How does the geisha work in this sense? So Japan is populated by samurais and geisha who eat sushi. And if you want to update things, drive fast cars. What's the significance of the geisha? I'm sure most of you have done gender classes here, so it should be easy for you. Huh? Yeah, but in terms of the power relationship here.
They're submissive or
Huh?
they're submissive to
Yeah, they're submissive, and who are they?
women.
They're women, yeah. The way the Orient is portrayed is as feminine, as feminized. The way the West is portrayed is as rational, as masculine. So in this sense, according to Said's reading of Orientalism, what Orientalism serves to do is to set up a situation where colonialism, the act of control, is legitimized. This parallels feminist thought. Feminists argue that the portrayal of women as submissive, as irrational, legitimizes the idea of patriarchy. Men need to be in control because men are rational. This is the argument, the feminist critique. So in many ways, the post-colonial critique mirrors the feminist critique. So particularly in Said's work, the Orient was depicted as feminine, as irrational, whereas the West was always rational. In this sense, this legitimizes the idea of intervention. So the rest of the world needs intervention from the West, from Russia to Syria to Africa, just in the same way as women need men. The same argument is used. So Said influenced the development of post-colonialism in international relations. Post-colonialism points to the forms of violence that went with the European creation of the international system or society of states. So here violence is foregrounded. When we talk of decolonization, we're neglecting to realize that colonialism was based on violence. There's very little acknowledgement of this. Historically, we can look at the argument within Japan over comfort women, but also we should extend this to looking at colonization in general. This wasn't just about the Second World War. What about the colonization of Korea and the colonization of Taiwan? Now, the argument which many members of the Abe administration, but particularly Ishinto apologists make, is that, well, the West hasn't apologized, which is true. The West has not apologized. When I went to school in the United Kingdom, we didn't even learn about colonialism. I did a history course, which was all about Britain, as if Britain was completely isolated from the rest of the world. And it was so boring. Nothing really happened in Britain in the 19th century. But when you look at what they did to the rest of the world, it was really interesting. I mean, that's been far more important than learning about, the Chartist movement within Britain. Who cares? It's the colonization of India, the colonization of Africa, which affected millions of people in the 19th century and the 20th century. That was accomplished through violence. In international relations, post-colonialism rejects the universalism of liberalism and critical theory. So liberalism is based on the idea of a view from nowhere. Liberals believe in the idea of freedom. Freedom is a universal ideal. Everybody wants freedom. What's the implication of this? This means everybody needs to be liberated. They need to be freed. People in Syria, people in Ukraine, they're not free. We are free. We, whoever we are, we in the West, we are free. So we need to do something about it. This is a form of universalism. Now, post-colonialism rejects any form of universalism. If we look at critical theory, critical theorists also believe in the idea of a thin form of universality. They believe in the idea of emancipation. Emancipation here means liberation, but liberation which is possible within existing political and social power structures. Post-colonialism, like post-structuralists, reject universalism. Universalism is always an apparatus of control. So there can be no post-colonial understandings of human rights. Actually, there is a very famous post-colonial theorist who has argued that the idea of human rights was actually put forward by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti in the late 18th century, early 19th century. But logically speaking, the idea of humanity itself is a universal category. So there cannot be, logically, a post-colonial theory of human rights and a post-colonial theory of human security, although I know many people who are writing about this because they can get published, but it makes no sense. Post-colonialism in IR is associated more specifically with the study of identity, how identities are constituted, and culture. Now, I have a case study here which I think leads directly on from the trailer to the Battle of Algiers. Orientalism and the War on Terror. So the War on Terror can be seen to embody particular definitions and discourses of terrorism that arise from Orientalism. So just as when we look at Japan, we find a dichotomy in the way Japan is viewed stereotypically from the West. On the one hand, we have the masculine figure of the samurai. What does the samurai do?
The warrior.
The warrior, but what do they do as a warrior?
Kill.
Kill people, yeah. And then we have the feminized figure of the geisha. What does the geisha do?
Entertaining.
Yeah, entertaining like comfort women, yes. So in this sense, it's very, we have exoticized, othered. The key question here, the key point here is it's other, it's exotic, it's different, it's not normal. They're not normal people in Japan. Everybody in Japan is either a samurai or a geisha, or today, probably a Doraemon character or a Pokemon character. Which is probably explains some of the foreign students we have at ICU. We get attracted by manga characters. Manga is soft power. Okay, now when we look at the Middle East, what's the dominant stereotype of the Middle East? When I say the Middle East, I'm talking about the Arab world, the world in which Said is from, Algeria, etc.
Salafism.
Huh?
Salafism.
Yeah, Salafism, but I'm not sure how many people would have heard of Salafism. What's the stereotype?
Women wear burqas.
Very good. Women wearing burqas, they're submissive, they hide themselves. It's feminized. And what's the masculine version of this? It's pretty obvious.
They're terrorists.
Yeah, terrorists, even though they come from South London, they're seen to come from the Middle East. You know, they're ISIS, terrorists, Al-Qaeda. You know, the name may change, but they're all terrorists. They're the problem. So if we look at the War on Terror, it embodies certain definitions and discourses of terrorism that arise from Orientalism. These, however, present a particular view of the present that distorts history. These include the existence of separate hierarchical spheres of civilization, West versus the Islamic world. This came through the work of Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, which we looked at in the GE course, Religion and Global Politics. So Huntington argued that a clash of civilizations was inevitable. Al-Qaeda agreed and said, yes, this is a great idea. Let's have a clash of civilizations. The problem is that people belong to multiple civilizations. And what this does is it takes one part of your identity and overdetermines it. Overdetermines it, says all of people who share the same facet of that identity are the same as you, have the same ideas. So all Japanese people are the same. They're samurais or geisha or Draimon characters. All Muslims are the same. They're either terrorists or they wear burqas. And frequently they're terrorists who wear burqas. And they have very different interests from people in the civilized world, the West, Japan, etc. People who don't wear burqas. People who are not terrorists. The second idea here is the need to defend modern Western values which are seen as universal values. Democracy, human rights. These apply to everybody, everywhere, from Oriental despotism. Oriental despotism is actually a term which Marx used in a sort of scientific term, because Marx was German and very clumsy. Oriental despotism doesn't really sound like a scientific term. Oriental despotism here means a despotic, tyrannical rule, like the rule of ISIS in the Middle East. So we need to defend our values from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda, from Saddam Hussein, even though all three groups hate each other and kill each other. So, and closely related to this is the need to protect vulnerable groups, women and children from local despots, Saddam Hussein or the Taliban. This is really important. If we look at the war on terror was about eliminating Al-Qaeda. Now, to all intents and purposes, Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011. Al-Qaeda was eliminated. But the West continued to occupy Afghanistan. Particularly the United States continued to occupy Afghanistan, even though everybody knew that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had relocated to Pakistan, their ally. Why were they in Afghanistan? To protect the people, to protect women and children from local despots, from the Taliban. The Taliban became the enemy, even though the Taliban weren't at all responsible for 9/11. In fact, the Taliban probably believed that flying planes is against Islam, so they had nothing to do with it. But the Taliban here became the enemy because they're seen as tyrannical. They represent the other. They're not civilized enough. So, in this sense, post-colonialism allows us to understand what is happening today. And it shows the continuity which exists with the colonial world, with ideas of Orientalism. However, in the remaining time, which I think is only 2 minutes, which we have left, I want to attempt an immanent critique of post-colonialism. Immanent critique is a term taken from critical theory. What it means, it's a sympathetic critique. So I'm sympathetic to the ideas of post-colonialism, but at the same time, I find that there are contradictions or assumptions which post-colonial theorists make, which I think are counterproductive. So the critique would be, firstly, that it ignores non-Western conceptions of international relations. Most post-colonial theory talks about the West. It talks about Western media, what's wrong with Western books, what's wrong with Western media channels, with discourses, etc. But there's very little about societies which are non-Western, and particularly non-Western conceptions of international relations. How did people in China conceive of international relations before the West? Yes, world politics is Eurocentric, but world politics existed before the West. We need more of a historical perspective in this. Closely allied to this is the idea of many post-colonial theorists that the recovery of native voice is seen as impossible given the totalizing nature of Orientalist and colonial discourse. To put it very simply and provocatively, one of the implications of post-colonial theory is that it silences the non-West. It basically says that everybody who attempts to make a statement on behalf of Islam, for example, are people who are working with Orientalist categories, Orientalist stereotypes. People who talk in terms of Hinduism are again using colonial categories. Even people talking in terms of Japan, by analogy, would be reproducing Orientalist discourses. Therefore, I think a critique of post-colonial theory will be it provides no alternative to Western international relations theory. I suggest, and this is where I'll conclude, that perhaps we need to move beyond post-colonialism to look at what a post-Western international relations theory would be. So a post-Western international relations theory, in my own view, would attempt to go beyond questioning the culturally specific meta-theoretical assumptions of Western IR. So what post-colonialism is very good at is questioning the assumptions of IR and looking at the colonialism which it reproduces and the violence which it reproduces. But we need to go beyond it. One way we can go beyond it is to look at the local, to look at localized sites of resistance to these discourses. In other words, people who refuse to accept Western categories, such as state, such as nation, such as capital. So a serious engagement here is needed with critical voices emanating outside of the West. Now, in my understanding, post-Western IR is different from non-Western IR. Non-Western IR means that we can come up with a Japanese or an Indian or a Chinese school of international relations, a Chinese theory of international relations or international relations with Chinese characteristics. My argument is it's impossible because of Orientalist discourse. You can't talk in terms of China, India, and Japan as self-contained units. But at the same time, in terms of methodology, instead of spending all our time reading books written by Western people, critiquing other Western people, accusing them of using colonial stereotypes, perhaps we could do more work looking at, let's say, what the Chinese consider to be international relations, what their understanding of international relations will be, what Indian understandings of international relations are, and what historical and political traditions it is founded upon.